All right, guys, our next set of chapters. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and led him off the bus. He'd been on the bus for over 8 hours. Be careful, the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps, or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. Thanks for the ride, he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handcuff had been. The land was barren and desolate. He could see a few rundown buildings and some tents. Farther away, there was a cabin underneath 2 tall trees. Those 2 trees were the only plant life he could see. There weren't even weeds. The guard led Stanley into a small building. The sign in front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake Juvenile Correctional Facility." Next to it was another sign which declared that it was a violation of the Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosive weapons, drugs, or alcohol onto the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help but think, well, duh. The guard led Stanley into the building, where he felt the welcome relief of air conditioning. A man was sitting with his feet up on a desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited while a bus driver gave the man some papers to sign. "It's a lot of sunflower seeds," the bus guard said. Stanley noticed a burlap sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to the desk. "I quit smoking last month," said the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and as he signed his name, the snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat a sack of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk, because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and the other was for the driver. 9 hours here, and now 9 hours back, the guard grumbled. What a day. Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spit sunflower seed shells onto a waste paper basket. Then he walked around the desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me by name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that really was the man's name. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was then given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of a long-sleeve orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made of heavy plastic, which unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn onto the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him that he should wear 1 set to work in and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed. Then the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. You are to dig 1 hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every direction. Your shovel is your measuring stick. Breakfast is served at 4:30. Stanley must have looked surprised because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they started that early to avoid the hottest part of the day. "No one is going to babysit you," he said. "The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you'll be out in the sun. If you dig up anything interesting, you're to report it to me or any of the counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours." Stanley nodded to show he understood. "This isn't a Girl Scout camp," said Mr. Sir. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside into the blazing heat. "Take a good look around you," Mr. Sir said. "What do you see?" Stanley stared out across the vast wasteland. The air seemed thick with heat and dirt. "Not much," he said. Then hastily added, "Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir laughed. "You see any guard towers?" "No." "How about an electric fence?" "No, Mr. Sir." "There's no fence at all, is there?" "No, Mr. Sir." "You want to run away?" Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure of what he meant. "If you want to run away, go ahead. Start running. I'm not going to stop you." Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. I see you looking at my gun. Don't worry, I'm not going to shoot you. He tapped his holster. This is for the yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you. I'm not going to run away, Stanley said. Good thinking, said Mr. Sir. Nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence. Know why? We've got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be buzzard food in 3 days. Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange and carrying shovels dragging themselves towards the tents. You thirsty? Asked Mr. Sir. Yes, Mr. Sir, Stanley said gratefully. Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. There were 6 large gray tents. Each had a black letter on it, A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselor slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Padansky was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Padansky, as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words, Pendansky. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Padansky was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered with a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't too bad, said Mr. Padansky. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, said Mr. Padansky. I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor that he was innocent. I figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendansky to think he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, said his counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, said Stanley. Mr. Padansky said good and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Padansky called to them. Rex, Allen, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced warily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other black. What happened to Barf Bag? Said the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Padansky. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hands and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Allen, said Mr. Padansky. My name's not Allen, the boy said. It's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Padansky told Allen to go get to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. He led them inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the other on it. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Padansky asked. Barf Bag slept here, said X-Ray, kicking one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Padansky. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping on the same cot that had been used by someone named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles on one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced forward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Padansky as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Padansky. However, I prefer to use the names that their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return home and to become useful and hard-working members of society. It ain't just a nickname, said X-Ray. He told Mr. Padansky. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I see inside you, Mom. You've got a big, fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Padansky and Rex X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Padansky. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Padansky smiled at him. If it makes it feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have any questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. Well, you were all new once here, said Mr. Pinansky, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pinansky left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him. Do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, and he said, it's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why someone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little bit better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. Stanley took a shower, if you could call it that, ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call his smelly and scratchy cot a bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper was only allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold water. There was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into, then jumping back from, the spray until the water shut off automatically. He never managed to use his bar soap, which was just as well because he wouldn't have had time to rinse off the suds. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown, and the vegetables had once been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all and used his slice of bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on his plate, no matter how it tasted. What'd you do? One of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. They sent you here for a reason. Oh, he realized. I stole a pair of sneakers. The other boys thought that was funny. Stanley wasn't sure why. Maybe because their crimes were a lot worse than stealing shoes. From a store, or were they on someone's feet? Asked Squid. Neither, Stanley answered. They belonged to Clyde Livingston. Nobody believed him. Sweet feet, said X-Ray. Yeah, right. No way, said Squid. Now, as Stanley lay in his cot, he thought it was kind of funny in a way. Nobody had believed him when he had said he was innocent. Now, when he said he stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweet Feet Livingston was a famous baseball player. He led the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was also the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. He used to have the poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now. It had been taken by the police and was used as evidence in his guilt in the courtroom. Clyde Livingston also came to court. In spite of everything, when Stanley found out that Sweet Feet was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers and that he had donated them to raise money for the homeless shelter. He said he couldn't imagine what kind of horrible person could steal from homeless children. That was the worst part for Stanley. His hero thought he was a no-good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn over in his cot, he was afraid it was going to collapse under all his weight. He barely fit in it. When he finally managed to roll over on his stomach, the smell was so bad that he had to turn over again and try sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like sour milk. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring 2 cots away. Back at school, a bully named Derek Dunn used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaints seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even seemed to find it amusing that a little kid like Derek could pick on someone as big as Stanley. On the day Stanley was arrested, Derek Dunn had taken Stanley's notebook and after a long game of come and get it, finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' bathroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he'd missed his bus and had to walk home. It was while he was walking home, carrying his wet notebook, with the prospect of having to copy the ruined notes, that the sneakers fell from the sky. I was walking home, and the sneakers fell from the sky, he said to the judge. One hit me on the head. It had hurt, too. They hadn't exactly fallen from the sky. He had just walked out from under a freeway overpass, and the shoe hit him in the head. Stanley took it as a kind of a sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers, and suddenly a pair fell on top of him, seemingly out of nowhere, like a gift from God. Naturally, he had no way of knowing they belonged to Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had had a bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think that there was something special about the shoes, that they could somehow provide the key to his father's invention. It was too much of a coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley felt like he was holding Destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure why he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father, or maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable and humiliating day at school. A patrol car pulled alongside him. A policeman asked him why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on the radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. It turned out the sneakers had been stolen from a display at the homeless shelter. That evening, rich people were going to come to the shelter and pay $100 to eat the food that the poor people ate every day for free. Clyde Livingston had once lived in the shelter when he was younger, and he was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned, and it was expected that they would sell for over $5,000. All the money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed several months. His parents couldn't afford a lawyer. "You don't need a lawyer," his mother said. "Just tell the truth." Stanley told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he'd lied a little. He could have said that he found the shoes in the street. No one believed they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime despicable. Those shoes were valued at over $5,000. It was money that could provide food and shelter for the homeless, and you stole that from them just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said that there was an opening at Camp Green Lake, and he suggested that the discipline of the camp might improve Stanley's character. It was either that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a quick decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. All right, see you next time.